James Carter was the kind of man who blended seamlessly into the background of life. In his late 30s, he lived in a modest home nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of neighborhood where lawns were neatly trimmed, and the biggest excitement was the occasional yard sale. He worked as a mid-level manager at a local logistics company, a job that paid the bills but didn't ignite any passion. Day after day, he faced the same mundane tasks, managing spreadsheets, coordinating deliveries, and navigating office politics with practiced indifference. At home, James's life wasn't much different. He was a husband to Sarah, a preschool teacher with a bright smile and endless patience, and a father to 8-year-old Emma, whose world revolved around glitter glue and bedtime stories. James adored his family, but there was a distance he couldn't quite bridge. He often found himself retreating into the quiet refuge of his garage workshop, tinkering with old tools or listening to classic rock on low volume. It was his way of escaping the restlessness he didn't dare put into words. Faith had once been a cornerstone of James's life. He'd grown up attending church every Sunday, his mother's voice rising in hymns that still echoed faintly in his memory. But over the years, his connection to faith had faded, eroded by the grind of adult responsibilities and a string of disappointments he never fully processed. The Bible on his nightstand collected dust, and his prayers had dwindled to half-hearted whispers during moments of crisis. If pressed, James would say he still believed, but even he wasn't sure what that belief looked like anymore. It was a Tuesday evening when Sarah made a casual suggestion that would later haunt him. Over dinner, she mentioned wanting to take a family road trip to the mountains. "We need a change," she said, her voice light but edged with an unspoken yearning. "Something to get us out of this rut." James smiled, nodded, and promised to think about it, but he didn't mean it. The truth was, he didn't feel like doing anything that required effort. His life, predictable as it was, felt safe, and change, even for the better, was more than he was willing to confront. As James loaded the dishwasher that night, he glanced at the kitchen clock and sighed. Tomorrow would be another day of routine, another day of the same. What he didn't know was that his safe, predictable life was teetering on the edge of something unimaginable. The quiet cracks in his soul, the ones he'd been too distracted to notice, were about to be forced wide open. The morning began like any other. James sipped his coffee in silence, scrolling absent-mindedly through emails on his phone, while Emma chatted animatedly about her upcoming school play. Sarah reminded him about a grocery list, her voice lilting with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being ignored. It was a gray, drizzly day, the kind James associated with nothing more than heavier traffic and damp shoes. By lunchtime, James found himself behind the wheel of his car, heading to a client meeting across town. The rain had picked up, fat drops streaking his windshield as the wipers worked overtime to keep up. His favorite playlist hummed softly in the background, but James wasn't really listening. His mind was elsewhere, replaying a conversation with his boss that had left him feeling irritable and undervalued. As he approached the intersection of Willow and Main, a stretch of road he'd driven hundreds of times, something felt off. The light ahead had just turned green, and cars were moving forward cautiously, their tires hissing against the wet pavement. James glanced to his left, noticing a delivery truck approaching too fast. Far too fast. Time seemed to slow as the truck barreled through the red light. James slammed on the brakes, the screech of rubber and the thud of his heart filling his ears. The impact came an instant later, a deafening crash of metal on metal that sent his car spinning violently into the intersection. His head whipped back against the headrest, and the world around him became a chaotic blur of shattered glass and twisted steel. When the car came to a halt, silence descended, heavy and unnatural. James's chest burned with pain, and his vision blurred as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He could hear distant shouts, footsteps splashing through puddles, and the faint wail of approaching sirens. Then, a cold stillness crept over him, spreading from his chest outward. The pain faded, replaced by a numbness so profound it felt like being submerged in ice water. James's world dimmed as the edges of his vision dissolved into darkness. He was vaguely aware of paramedics arriving, their voices urgent and professional as they worked to free him from the mangled wreck. "We're losing him!" someone shouted, the words distant, as if carried on a fading wind. Then everything went silent. James Carter, the man whose life had been defined by its ordinariness, was declared clinically dead at 1:42 p.m. What followed defied explanation. James's journey was only beginning, but it was a journey that would change him and the world forever. The first thing James noticed was the silence, not the eerie kind, but a peaceful, encompassing quiet that seemed to hold the world in its embrace. He wasn't sure when the sound of sirens and human voices had faded or when the pain had melted away like snow under a warm sun. All he knew was that he felt weightless. He opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. The colors around him were unlike anything he had ever seen, soft yet radiant, as if the very air was infused with light. The gray drizzle of the rainy day was gone, replaced by a golden hue that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. He tried to move, but there was no sensation of limbs or effort. It was as if he were drifting on an invisible current, light as a feather, and free from the constraints of gravity or flesh. Looking down, he saw himself, or the version of himself that had been left behind. The scene below was frozen in stark clarity. Paramedics working frantically over his lifeless body, the twisted wreck of his car, and the faces of bystanders, some shocked, others pale with fear. James felt no panic or urgency, just a deep, almost detached curiosity. It was as if the body he'd known as his own was merely a shell, something familiar but no longer essential. Before he could process what was happening, a new sensation swept over him, an irresistible pull, like a gentle but commanding hand drawing him upward. The golden light grew brighter, enveloping him completely, and with it came a warmth that wasn't just physical, but emotional, spiritual, even eternal. It was a warmth that filled the deepest cracks of his soul, washing away the years of fatigue, doubt, and regret. Then he saw them. Figures began to emerge from the light, radiant and indistinct at first, but slowly sharpening into forms that defied earthly understanding. They were beings of pure light, their shapes humanoid, yet unbound by the limitations of flesh. James felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of familiarity, as if these beings had always been part of his life, watching from the edges of his existence. Their presence radiated love so profound that it brought tears to his eyes, if tears were even possible here. The beings didn't speak, not with words. Instead, their thoughts seemed to flow directly into his mind, messages of comfort and welcome, as if they were guides preparing him for the next step of his journey. He felt himself moving, though he couldn't tell if he was walking, floating, or simply being carried by their presence. Ahead, the light seemed to intensify, beckoning him towards something greater, something unimaginable. As James moved deeper into this realm, he realized with absolute clarity he was no longer part of the world he had known. He had crossed over. The golden light that had embraced James grew softer as it opened into a world that felt both alien and deeply familiar. The air shimmered, as if alive with its own pulse, and the sky, if it could be called that, was a kaleidoscope of hues that shifted and danced like liquid light. There was no sun, yet everything glowed with an ethereal radiance, as if the place itself emanated its own eternal brightness. James found himself standing in a vast meadow, though the word meadow felt inadequate. The grass was a vibrant green that seemed to hum with life, each blade glistening as if kissed by morning dew. Flowers bloomed in every direction, their colors so vivid they seemed to sing in harmony with the atmosphere. A soft breeze carried a melody, not music as James knew it, but a symphony of sounds that resonated in his very being, a chorus of peace, joy, and love. Then he saw them. In the distance, familiar figures approached, their faces glowing with recognition and joy. His heart, if he still had one, leapt. His grandparents, long gone from the earthly realm, walked toward him, their expressions filled with love and warmth. "James," his grandmother said, her voice ringing clear in his mind without ever moving her lips. It wasn't just a greeting, it was a homecoming. They embraced, though the sensation wasn't physical. It was a connection deeper than anything James had ever known, a merging of love and memory that felt like sunlight pouring into his soul. Briefly, he thought of all the times he'd wondered about the afterlife, doubting, questioning. Now he stood among those who had passed, and their presence was more real than anything he had experienced in the mortal world. As James reveled in the reunion, a new presence emerged, a light brighter than all others, yet soft enough to look upon. Slowly, the figure took form, clothed in a white robe that seemed to glow from within. His face, though human in appearance, carried a depth of wisdom and authority that transcended comprehension. His eyes, filled with infinite kindness, seemed to pierce through James, seeing every part of him, every joy, every pain. James knew who it was before the figure even spoke. "Welcome, James," Jesus said, his voice resonating like the melody of 1,000 strings. It wasn't just sound, it was understanding, compassion, and love wrapped into every syllable. James felt himself fall to his knees, not out of fear, but from the sheer weight of the presence before him. Jesus reached out a hand, lifting James to his feet. "You have questions," he said, his tone gentle yet firm, "and soon you will have answers." As James stood before the one he had longed to understand, he felt an overwhelming peace, mixed with a growing sense of purpose. This was no mere visit. He had been brought here for a reason. James stood before Jesus, his entire being trembling with a mixture of awe and humility. The light emanating from him was unlike anything James could describe, warm, radiant, and all-encompassing. Yet, there was also a weight to his presence, as though the truth of the universe rested within the figure before him. James could feel every flaw, every doubt, and every selfish moment of his life laid bare under the piercing gaze of those eyes. But there was no condemnation, only understanding and an invitation to listen. "James," Jesus began, his voice resonating not just in the air but within James's very soul. "You have lived your life like many others, focused on what is temporary, while neglecting what is eternal." The words struck like a gentle yet undeniable blow. James's mind flooded with memories. The countless nights he'd spent consumed by work instead of being present with his family. The casual neglect of his faith. The moments of anger and selfishness he had justified in the name of stress or exhaustion. He had thought of himself as a good man, decent, hardworking, providing for his family. But now, standing before the source of all love and truth, he realized how shallow his definition of goodness had been. "I gave you the gift of love, compassion, and purpose," Jesus continued, "but you allowed the noise of the world to drown it out. Like so many others, you traded what matters for what fades." James's knees buckled under the weight of those words. He had spent his life chasing things that felt important: career advancement, material comfort, fleeting moments of personal satisfaction. But now, in this eternal realm, he saw how hollow it all was. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I didn't know. I didn't see." Jesus knelt beside him, lifting his chin with a touch so gentle it felt like pure light. "You are here because you must understand. This is not about punishment, but about awakening. There is still time for you, James, time for humanity, but the path you are on leads to darkness." James's heart clenched at the gravity of those words. "Darkness?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What do you mean?" Jesus stood, his expression filled with both sorrow and resolve. The choices humanity makes, choices driven by greed, hate, and indifference, are unraveling the love and unity that hold the world together. If this path continues, the light will fade, and what remains will be a shadow of what was meant to be. The air around them seemed to shift, growing heavier, as if preparing for what was to come. "I will show you, James," Jesus said, "not to punish, but to prepare. You must see what lies ahead." And with that, the golden light dimmed, replaced by a cold, creeping darkness. James felt a chill settle over him as the radiant warmth of the heavenly realm gave way to an oppressive shadow. He stood on the edge of a vast expanse, the ground beneath his feet hard and cracked, like the dry remnants of a parched riverbed. The air was thick, heavy with a sense of despair that seemed to claw at his very soul. In the distance, he could see faint glimmers of light, but they were weak, flickering like dying embers against a vast, encroaching void. "This," Jesus said, his voice now heavy with sorrow, "is what will come if humanity does not change." Before James could respond, the vision unfolded. He saw cities, once vibrant and bustling, now hollow and gray. Buildings stood in ruins, their skeletal remains casting long shadows over streets that were eerily silent. The people who wandered through these desolate landscapes looked lost, their faces etched with emptiness. It wasn't the emptiness of hunger or sickness, it was deeper, a spiritual hollowness that no food or medicine could fill. As James watched, the darkness spread, creeping into every corner of the world. He saw families fractured, friends turning against one another, and communities consumed by mistrust and anger. There were no grand wars, no apocalyptic firestorms, just a slow, relentless decay of love, compassion, and unity. It was a world where selfishness reigned, where people lived for themselves and no one else. He turned to Jesus, his voice cracking with desperation. "Why? Why is this happening?" "Because they have forgotten," Jesus replied, his tone steady, yet filled with infinite sadness. "They have turned away from love, from faith, from me. Instead, they chase what cannot last: wealth, power, and fleeting pleasure. They have hardened their hearts to the suffering of others, and in doing so, they have opened the door to this darkness." James's eyes filled with tears as the vision continued. He saw children growing up without hope, their innocence stripped away by a world too consumed with itself to care. He saw natural beauty, forests, oceans, and skies, polluted and defiled, the earth itself groaning under the weight of humanity's neglect. And through it all, the darkness loomed, feeding on the despair and division, growing stronger with each passing moment. Suddenly, James was thrust into another scene. He stood in a crowded room filled with people shouting at one another, their voices angry and venomous. No one listened. No one cared. It was as if they had all forgotten how to see each other as human beings. The darkness seeped into the room, coiling around each person like a living thing, amplifying their rage and fear. James turned back to Jesus, his heart breaking under the weight of what he had seen. "Why are you showing me this? I'm just one man. What can I possibly do?" Jesus placed a hand on James's shoulder, his gaze piercing yet kind. "Because you have been given a voice, James, you must warn them. Tell them what you have seen. Tell them that love is the only way back to the light. If enough hearts turn, the darkness can be pushed back. But it will not be easy." James wanted to protest, to plead for someone else to carry this burden. But as he looked into Jesus' eyes, he felt a spark of courage, a seed of purpose planted deep within his soul. He didn't know how he would do it, or if anyone would listen, but he knew he couldn't remain silent. As the vision faded, the darkness gave way to the golden light once more, and James felt the warmth of hope returning to him. But the weight of the mission remained, pressing against his chest like a solemn vow. The path ahead was uncertain, but James understood one thing with absolute clarity. He had been chosen for this, and he could not turn away. James stood before Jesus, the weight of the vision still pressing heavily on his heart. He felt small, insignificant in the face of such a monumental task. The images of darkness consuming the world, of people suffering in isolation and despair, haunted him. How could one man, just an ordinary, flawed man, carry the burden of warning humanity? The doubt swirled in his mind like a storm, threatening to overwhelm him. "You want me to warn them?" James finally asked, his voice trembling. "How? Why would they listen to me? I'm no prophet. I'm just me." Jesus' expression softened, his eyes filled with both understanding and encouragement. "You are not chosen because you are perfect, James. You are chosen because you understand love, even in its simplest form, and because you have seen the truth, you can share it with those who have not." James shook his head, taking a step back. "But I've failed so many times. I've been selfish, distracted. I've let my family down. I've let you down. How can I convince anyone to change when I don't even know if I can?" Jesus placed a hand on James's shoulder, the touch radiating warmth and reassurance. "None of this depends on your perfection, James. It depends on your willingness. Humanity does not need a savior. That role has already been fulfilled. What they need is a messenger, someone who has seen what lies ahead and is willing to speak the truth, no matter the cost." James swallowed hard, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. What if they don't listen? What if it's too late? "Every act of love, no matter how small, pushes back the darkness," Jesus replied. "It is not your responsibility to save the world, only to share what you have seen. Some will hear you, and their hearts will change. Others will not. But do not let fear silence you. The light is never extinguished as long as love remains." James felt a flicker of hope, small but growing. He still didn't feel ready. How could anyone be ready for such a task? But he began to understand that his reluctance was part of the journey. He would never feel fully prepared, and that was the point. Faith, he realized, wasn't about certainty. It was about moving forward, even when the path was unclear. "What do I say?" James asked, his voice steadier now. "Speak of love," Jesus said. "Speak of unity, compassion, and forgiveness. Remind them that the choices they make every day matter, not just for themselves but for the world, and above all, remind them that they are loved, even in their darkest moments." James nodded, the spark of resolve deepening into a quiet fire. He didn't know how he would begin, but he knew he couldn't turn away from the task. The vision, the message, and the weight of Jesus' words were now a part of him, inseparable from his very being. Jesus smiled, a radiance of love and encouragement that James would carry with him forever. "Go now, James. The journey will be hard, but you will not walk it alone." And with that, the light around him began to shift, growing dimmer as James felt himself being drawn away. The transition was abrupt. One moment, James was standing in the warm, golden light of the heavenly realm, and the next, he was being hurled back into the cold, harsh reality of the physical world. His body felt heavy, as if it were made of lead, and the first sensation that registered was pain, sharp, searing pain radiating through every fiber of his being. James gasped, his lungs burning as they filled with air for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Voices surrounded him, urgent, frantic. The rhythmic beeping of machines and the metallic clatter of medical instruments invaded his senses. His eyelids fluttered open, the fluorescent lights of the hospital room glaring down at him. Everything felt disjointed, as though his body and mind were struggling to reconnect. "He's back," someone shouted, their voice filled with disbelief. "We've got a pulse." James tried to speak, but his throat was dry and the words wouldn't come. His body felt alien, stiff, and unresponsive. Every movement sent waves of pain through him, and his vision blurred as tears pooled in his eyes, not from the physical agony, but from the overwhelming sense of separation. The peace and love of the afterlife were gone, replaced by the harshness of the earthly realm. Julie, his wife, was by his side in an instant, her face pale and streaked with tears. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're alive! You're alive!" He looked at her, his heart aching with both relief and sorrow. He wanted to tell her everything, but the words felt too big, too heavy to form. Instead, he squeezed her hand weakly, his fingers barely brushing hers. The days that followed were a blur of recovery. James endured surgeries, physical therapy, and countless tests as doctors marveled at his survival. "It's a miracle," they said, though they had no way of knowing just how true that was. The physical toll was immense: broken bones, internal injuries, and a constant, dull ache that refused to subside. But it was the emotional toll that weighed on him most. The memories of what he had seen and heard burned brightly in his mind, but sharing them felt impossible. How could he explain the love he had felt, the vision of darkness, the command from Jesus himself? Who would believe him? At night, when the hospital was quiet and his family had gone home, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts consumed by the weight of his mission. He felt isolated, caught between two worlds. The heavenly realm had felt like home, while earth now felt foreign, hostile even. He longed to return to the peace he had known, but he couldn't ignore the urgency of his task. The memory of Jesus' words echoed in his mind. Every act of love pushes back the darkness. Slowly, James began to accept what had happened to him. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't know where to start. But one thing was clear. He had been sent back for a reason. The weight of that reason pressed heavily on his chest, but it also lit a fire in his soul. James Carter had returned, and his mission was just beginning. James's first attempt to share his experience came with the people he trusted most: his wife, Julie, and his best friend, Tom. They sat together at the kitchen table late one evening, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Julie had insisted on hearing everything, but as James recounted the vision of darkness, the heavenly realm, and Jesus' warning, her expression shifted from awe to quiet disbelief. Tom, a practical man with a skeptical streak, leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So you're saying you met Jesus and saw the future of humanity?" Tom asked, his tone tinged with incredulity. James nodded, his hands trembling as he clutched his mug of tea. "I know how it sounds, but it was real. I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Julie reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "I believe you," she said softly, though the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her struggle to comprehend it all. Tom, however, wasn't as easily convinced. "James, you went through something traumatic. Near-death experiences can feel vivid, but they're just the brain reacting. Scientists have proven this stuff," Tom argued. "Are you sure you're not misinterpreting it?" James sighed, his heart heavy. "I don't need to prove anything, Tom. I just need to share what I saw. Whether people listen or not, that's up to them." Despite the mixed reactions, James felt compelled to keep going. His next step was speaking to a small group at his local church. The room was filled with familiar faces, people he'd known for years, who now looked at him with curiosity and apprehension. As James recounted his experience, he could see their emotions shifting. Some leaned forward, captivated by his words, while others exchanged doubtful glances. "Jesus said we need to choose love over hate," James told them, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "He showed me what happens if we don't. Darkness will consume everything, but there's still time to change." Afterward, a woman approached him in tears. "I lost my son last year," she said, her voice trembling. "Hearing you talk about heaven, it gives me hope that he's at peace." But not everyone was moved. A man standing nearby scoffed loudly. "This is just another one of those near-death fairy tales," he muttered. "Nothing but imagination." As James's story began to spread, so did the polarization. Invitations came in from other churches and community events where he shared his vision with growing crowds. Some people embraced his message, finding solace and inspiration in his words. Others dismissed him as a delusional man seeking attention. Online forums buzzed with debates, skeptics picking apart his testimony, while supporters defended him with fervor. The scrutiny was draining, but James pressed on. He reminded himself of Jesus' words, "Every act of love pushes back the darkness. For every doubter, there was someone who felt renewed hope." That was enough to keep him going. Over time, James found himself speaking to larger audiences, his story reaching far beyond his small town. He wasn't a polished speaker, but his sincerity touched hearts. He spoke not to convert or persuade, but to share, leaving the choice to his listeners. Some cried, some argued, but James stayed true to his mission, knowing that every word carried the potential to ignite change. Years passed, and James's message rippled out in ways he couldn't have anticipated. It began with small, quiet transformations, neighbors mending old feuds, families reconnecting, individuals finding renewed purpose in acts of kindness. James received letters and emails from strangers who had heard his story and felt inspired to make changes in their lives. "I hadn't spoken to my sister in years," one letter read. "After hearing your story, I reached out. We're rebuilding what we lost." Churches that had hosted James saw a renewed energy in their congregations. Communities organized food drives, supported struggling families, and created spaces for open dialogue about faith and love. The darkness James had seen in his vision wasn't gone, but glimmers of light began to push against its edges. Yet, James knew the work was far from over. For every person who embraced the message, there were many who remained indifferent or hostile. The criticism persisted, with skeptics labeling him a fraud or a fool. But James had come to accept that not everyone would believe, and that wasn't his responsibility. His task was to plant seeds of hope and trust that they would grow. Reflecting on his journey, James often thought about the man he had been before the accident. Complacent, disconnected, focused on things that didn't truly matter. He could never return to that life. His encounter with Jesus had left him changed, and that change drove him forward, even on the hardest days. One evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sunset, a young woman approached him. She looked hesitant, clutching a small notebook. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. "Your story saved my life. I was in such a dark place, but hearing you talk about love and faith, it reminded me that there's still light." James smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "It's not my story," he replied. "It's his." As the years went on, James's message continued to spread, carried by those who had heard it and been changed. He knew he would never see the full impact of his mission, but that was okay. His role was to speak, to share, to love. The rest was in hands far greater than his own. In the quiet of the night, James often prayed for those who doubted, for those consumed by darkness, and for the strength to keep going. He ended every prayer the same way. "Thank you for the light. Help me keep it alive." And as the sun rose each morning, James woke with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the fight against the darkness wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who chose love over hate, faith over fear. His final words to every audience were always the same. "The choice is yours. Darkness or light. What will you choose?" Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.